Hi friends, if you're enjoying this series and you'd like to help me reach even more people with thinking faith, please consider supporting the show. Silver supporters get early access to episodes and bonus content. Gold supporters also get signed books and a monthly catch-up with me. The links to support are with the show notes or visit justinbrierley.com. Enjoy today's episode.
I don't see what this has got to do with belief in God. We're not talking about a surprising rebirth of belief in the utility of believing in God.
There is this meaning crisis. A lot of people who were holding on to the atheist materialist thing have been let down.
The kind of Christianity that returns might be the kind of strong-armed, aggressive, arrogant Christianity that we've been quite right to criticize and condemn.
The fact that you find those verses morally repugnant is because I'm going to do the Tom Holland thing.
What is the one piece of evidence that convinces Justin that there's a God?
Do not all charms fly at the mere touch of cold philosophy?
And what is one piece of evidence that convinces Alex that there is not?
Welcome back to the surprising rebirth of belief in God with me, Justin Brierley. Today, a live bonus episode recorded recently in Edinburgh, where I was in conversation with well-known atheist YouTuber Alex O'Connor. And we decided to bring this episode forward a little on the podcast this week, as we recently made the video of this conversation available over on our YouTube channel. And there's a link with today's show if you want to watch it. We'll return to the current act of our documentary series on mind, meaning, and the materialists next time. I think you're going to really enjoy today's conversation, recorded in front of over 300 people at Central Hall, Edinburgh, and it sees myself and Alex discussing my thesis that we may be seeing a rebirth of belief in God in our culture. It was a joy to meet so many listeners of this podcast too among the audience. Towards the end of the conversation, we also get to tease out some of the objections to Christian faith that Alex raised in our Unheard Club discussion in London the previous month. And there's also a beautiful moment coming up when Alex recites a C.S. Lewis poem from memory, which for me was really the highlight of the evening. So just before we jump in, I'm delighted to say I'll be travelling again this summer within both the UK and the USA for some speaking engagements. I'll be talking about the surprising rebirth of belief in God and looking forward to plenty of questions and discussions. There's going to be books available to purchase and sign at these events too. So coming up in the UK in July, on Friday the 12th of July at 8 p.m, I'm at English Labrie in Surrey. That's an evening lecture in the beautiful grounds of English Labrie with opportunity for Q&A. There's a Zoom option available for that one too. Also on Tuesday the 30th of July, I'll be speaking at the New Day Festival in Norwich at 11:30am and 7pm. That's a youth festival, New Day 2024 in the morning and evening. So do go and check out the link for both of those. California, I'll be coming your way in August. Got several dates in the diary for California. Sunday the 11th of August, I'll be speaking at the morning services at Vintage Church LA in Santa Monica. On Sunday the 18th of August, I'll be speaking at the morning services for Reality Church Ventura and a special evening event from 6 to 8 p.m. as well. I'll be over at Reality San Francisco. That's for a special event there for the launch of their citywide Alpha initiative. That's on Tuesday the 20th of August. So in San Francisco, Tuesday the 20th of August in the evening. And finally, at Park Hill Church, San Diego on Sunday the 25th of August. Again, speaking at the church's morning services and a special 6 p.m. evening event. So a few dates in California if you're in that area. And finally, coming up in September, I'll be revisiting the Biblical Worldview Conference at Prestonwood Church, Dallas. That's from Sunday the 22nd to Tuesday the 24th of September. Looking forward to speaking there again, along with my 19-year-old son, Noah. That's 3 days of the Biblical Worldview Conference in Plano, Dallas. Other speakers include Lee Strobel, Peter J. Williams, Ali Beth Stuckey, Jeremiah J. Johnston hosting the event. Maybe lining up some more events in Texas yet to be confirmed, so watch this space. Again, if you want the link with all of the details of those speaking events, it's with the show notes from today's program. If you've been enjoying this podcast, why not consider helping us to continue it through the rest of the year? Your support helps me to reach new audiences through events such as the one you're about to hear. The links to support are all with today's show. So, without further ado, here is my conversation with Alex O'Connor, hosted by Trinity Forum Europe, and the moderator is Patrick Brown. Well, just before we get into the rest of today's show, someone we've heard from quite a bit on the podcast is author and speaker Glenn Scrivener. Hello, Glenn.
Hey, Justin. Always great to be here.
Well, for a while now, you've been happily pointing people to your online course 321. Where did that come from?
It's a passion of mine to help people get to grips with Christian faith and to do it in a way that's attractive and imaginative and deep and that assumes no prior knowledge. So 321 is my way of showing life according to Jesus. We want it to be like a mere Christianity for a digital age.
Okay, so that sounds like it's maybe more for those who are not Christians?
Well, yeah, many people have done it who are not Christians, and they've found faith for the first time. We're thrilled about that. But like with Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, Christians love that book too. And the first audience we have in mind for 321 is actually a Christian who wants to be refreshed in their faith and to have something to pass on to their Christian curious friends and family.
Okay, so Christian or not, this basically gets people to the heart of the faith.
Right, and nearly 10,000 people have joined the online platform. It's free. You watch these video-led sessions and you think through the stunning animations, you engage with the chat community, you get a ton of extra content thrown in, and now you have on your phone a Mere Christianity that you can share with others. So the phrase we're using is, you can share this without shame, without cost, and without delay.
Well, we've been really enjoying promoting 321, and listeners to this podcast can get into it instantly by going to 321course.com/JB. That's 321course.com/JB. Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you, Justin. Keep up the good work.
Good evening. My name is Patrick Brown. I am honored that we have a full house here. Thank you so much for coming along. I work for Trinity Forum Europe, and so on behalf of Trinity Forum Europe, I would like to give a warm welcome to each and every one of you here, as well as our esteemed guests, Justin and Alex. Trinity Forum, a bit about it. Trinity Forum Europe aims to help leaders and future leaders think, live, and lead well, engaged with Christian perspectives. To do this, we are fundamentally in the business of creating and encouraging space for conversation in community on important issues of life, culture, and ethics in dialogue with some of the best of Christian thought. So it's in some ways, it's kind of surreal to be sitting here because many years ago, I was watching you guys on YouTube. And just earlier today, Justin called me when he arrived, and I'm like, oh, wow, it's him. So Justin, of course, as well as Alex, they're the professionals here. They're the ones that engage in these conversations regularly. So I'm going to try to center you guys as much as possible this evening. Justin, a bit about him. He's a freelance writer, speaker, and broadcaster who has become known for creating dialogues between Christians and non-Christians. Perhaps most famously, the longtime host of Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio. He has 2 books out. The first is Unbelievable, Why After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists, I'm Still a Christian. And his newest book is The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. That might sound familiar because it's the name of the event tonight. Both those books are for sale in the back if you would like to grab those in a chat with Justin afterwards. Alex, congratulations on surpassing 800,000 subscribers on YouTube. I looked at your bio and it only said 750, so it must be quite recent that you've crossed the 800 threshold. I remember when I was studying years ago, first coming across your videos, even though I may have disagreed with certain points you made, I very much respected the nuance, the careful thinking that you expressed in those videos, and so thrilled that you are here as well. Alex is a philosophy-oriented YouTuber. If you're unfamiliar with him, went by the name Cosmic Skeptic. If you still want to go by that name, we can talk about that later. But he's a YouTuber. His YouTube channel is Cosmic Skeptic, as well as you can find him at Alex O'Connor. He also has a podcast. He launched the Within Reason podcast, which has featured guests including Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Slavoj Zizek, forgive me for my pronunciation, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and recently Rory Stewart, amongst others. He's debated issues of religion, ethics, and politics with figures including Ben Shapiro, Michael Knowles, Douglas Murray, and Piers Morgan. To start with a bit of a quote, A.W. Tozer, who you may be familiar with as a theologian, once said, "What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. Now, whether you agree with that sentiment or not, I think it at least gets at why we want to host this event tonight. This surprising rebirth of belief in God and what is significant about it. So I'd like to begin by turning it over to Justin to speak a bit about what inspired you to write this book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here in Edinburgh and this lovely venue, and for everyone for coming. So thank you. It's so nice to be here for this conversation. The book really came out of having hosted these conversations between Christians and non-Christians for, well, about 17 years. And just seeing that there was a real change in the tone of the conversations over those years. So My Unbelievable show was birthed in the sort of heyday of the New Atheism about 6 months after I started the show. The God Delusion was published, and that was the first of a number of these best-selling anti-God books. And that movement just kind of continued to grow over the next few years. You had the Atheist Bus campaign. You had this very dogmatic, strong form of atheism in the headlines. And so that was the tone of the conversations that I was hosting. Often it was these new atheist type figures who were engaging with Christian thinkers. And that was a lot of fun. It was very dynamic. But I did notice as the years went on that increasingly a number of people who weren't Christians didn't want to identify with the new atheism either. And they felt that it was too shrill, too dogmatic, almost too fundamentalist itself. And so I would often get people saying, I'm not a Richard Dawkins kind of atheist, just to sort of say where they stood on the spectrum. And then increasingly in more recent years, I started to notice actually that the new atheist movement itself kind of went through a lot of turbulence. A lot of the key leaders were involved in controversies. Richard Dawkins himself kind of had a few gaffes online, and then he got stripped of his Humanist of the Year award in America. And this was because issues like transgender and sexuality and identity and so on were starting to become hot-button cultural issues. And suddenly it felt like a lot of the people who were kind of united at one time in the new atheist movement saying, we don't believe in God, we believe religion's bad for you. Suddenly they weren't agreeing any longer on these significant issues in the culture. And Richard Dawkins took one side, and maybe another significant person like P.Z. Myers took another side. And suddenly the debates and arguments they were having internally were far worse than any they had with their Christian counterparts. And I saw the movement kind of unravel internally to the point where, some of these people refused to share a stage with each other at the atheist conferences and things like that. So that was interesting to see. And then on top of that, as the new atheist movement consequently kind of waned in its influence, I started to see the emergence of similar public intellectuals drawing large audiences, but being far more sympathetic to Christianity than Dawkins and Harris and Dennett and Hitchens and so on. And so that, the preeminent example is Jordan Peterson, who Alex has only very recently interviewed. And he's a good example of someone who was in the same kind of intellectual milieu as them, having big arena conversations and debates with Sam Harris when he kind of came onto the scene, but with a very different way of looking at faith, very open to the value of faith, not dismissing it, and kind of often at times almost seeming to be almost saying things that sounded very Christian himself. So I was fascinated by that, and over time started to see more and more of these types of figures emerge. So another good example is Tom Holland, the historian who hosts the Rest is History podcast, when his book Dominion was published, which was really an argument for the way in which Christianity has essentially shaped the moral instincts of the West. Again, it was very interesting because this was a secular historian with a big platform saying things that were essentially, actually, atheism has not given us, secularism, science has not given us these values. It's down to Christianity. And again, it just felt like a really interesting, fresh take on the conversation, not from a Christian. And this was the interesting thing. And where I kind of, the idea for the book came from really was the fact that in a conversation again with Douglas Murray, who's again a non-Christian, but who calls himself a Christian atheist. I got him in a conversation with the New Testament historian N.T. Wright, and he was commenting on the fact that there's that famous poem by Matthew Arnold, the Victorian poet, Dover Beach, which talks about the melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith, which was written about 150 years ago. And many people have talked about that and said it's only continued, secularism has continued to drive that sea of faith further out. And he said, well, the thing about the sea of faith, Justin, is it could come back in again. I mean, that's the point of tides. And that that just resonated with me when he said that. And he's a good example of one of these people who I think was very much, friends with the new atheist, was quite influenced by it in the mid-2000s. But I think has later come to realize actually all the values he holds dear actually didn't come from atheism. They came from the Christian heritage. And so he's a sort of wistful agnostic in many ways, and hence why he calls himself a Christian atheist. And so I just wanted to kind of put this all down in a book. And so The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God was really my attempt to distill what I felt was happening in the culture. And on top of that, I was also bumping into interesting stories of adult converts to Christianity. And those have only continued to proliferate, actually, since the book was published. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a well-known new atheist figure, has said she's now a Christian. Russell Brand has been in the headlines for being baptized. And so I just found it fascinating that at the moment when the book got published, it felt like suddenly everyone was saying, oh, well, maybe we do need Christianity after all. Maybe we threw the baby out with the bathwater. So it was encouraging to sort of have this thesis kind of at some level ratified in that way. And I began a podcast series as well of the same name, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And again, that's just brought all kinds of other interesting stories out from people who said, yeah, I think I'm experiencing this same thing as you, Justin. So that's kind of, I'm on the journey and just fascinated to continue to uncover those stories.
So would you say the title of your book, is it The Surprising Rebirth of God ? Or are you making a definitive case that there is a rebirth in the belief in God?
I think I'm saying there is a rebirth, a belief in God, but I'm not saying that equals a revival right now. And Alex and I were together only a month ago at the Unheard Club in London, and that was the title of the conversation. Are we seeing a Christian revival, essentially? And actually, my answer was no, I don't think we are, even despite the title of my book. What I do think we're seeing is the beginnings of the possibility of that, because it feels like the atmosphere has changed. So what I'm describing in the book, and it does use a kind of incoming tide as its sort of central metaphor, is a turning of the tide. I don't think we're seeing a great big wave coming back at us, but I do feel like the secular materialist project maybe has sort of reached its furthest ebb, and we're now just starting to see the first signs of something happening where actually that tide of faith might come back in again.
Wonderful. As I turn it over to Alex for his perspective, I want to start. Are you willing to give your conversion story in Justin's next book?
But that might be a few years away, yeah. But
Just kidding. But what is your perspective on this? Had you become to the same conclusions? Do you disagree with the conclusion? What are your thoughts on?
There's a lot to say about this. The first, it's funny you mentioned the question mark. I would have sort of gunned for a question mark in the title of this event, if only because when I shared it online, a lot of my commenters were duly skeptical. They thought that they were sort of like, what do you mean? Why have you put your face next to this title? Because there are a number of ways in which I think it is unjustifiable to say that there's a surprising rebirth of belief in God. The first is that it's not said with a question mark. The second is that we're not talking, in my view, here about, I know what Justin's talking about, the sort of feeling in the air that the conversation has shifted a bit. New atheism springs up in a time before long-form media was taken very seriously, at a time of sort of TV sound bites, at a time when there was this thing called new atheism, and the thing that's new about it is the fact that it's got this new sort of suave, rhetorical edge to it, and that was popular. I think that what people are doing is getting bored with that style of argumentation. They're getting fed up of arguments that don't last for more than 5 minutes and are based on sound bites, and they've started to enjoy watching 2-hour-long conversations, 2.5-hour-long conversations. And if you were to cross-examine some of these people, as we've managed to do in the modern day with at least some of them, in a more collected, calm manner, allowing everybody to actually explain the end of their argument, you realize that the sort of celestial dictator thing, the sort of, oh, well, I'm not really interested in that, I'm just interested in educating for evolution, that kind of stuff just falls apart. There isn't actually much there anymore. So people get sort of, I think, bored of the bickering, of the shouting back and forth. It's fun for a bit, and then it's not. That's what I think has changed. I don't see what this has got to do with belief in God. We're not talking about a surprising rebirth of belief in the utility of believing in God. I mean, all of the examples that Justin talks about, Douglas Murray, Tom Holland, Jordan Peterson, don't really believe in God, at least not in a sense that is that we could confidently say. I mean, in the way that Douglas Murray as a is a Christian atheist. I think Jordan Peterson might best be described as an atheist Christian. Same effect of there sort of being no serious identifiable belief in God. So what is it that's actually emerging here? What is it that's changing? What is this sort of shift in the air? Well, we know it's not a belief in God, at least not based on our most recent statistics. We can look at the census, as Justin well knows. The last census in this country showed that for the first time, famously, Christianity is now makes up the minority of our population. And it's possible that in 10 years' time we'll see that sort of reverse and start going up again. I can't say that's not possible, but to say that we have any statistical direction here that Christianity is making a comeback, I think is ungrounded. Some religious groups are growing, for example, Islam. So the good news is that there might be a surprising belief in rebirth and belief in God. The bad news is it's the wrong God. So I guess it kind of depends on what we're talking about here. But it seems to me that what's really going on here is, notice, for example, that a lot of the people that are pointed to, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Jordan Peterson, Douglas Murray, these people occupy the political right. Is that a coincidence? Do we think that Douglas Murray considers himself to be Christian adjacent because he's sort of sat in a room somewhere, prayed to God and started to hear someone talking back? Or do you think he's just upset with the way that the country's going, has been convinced by people like Tom Holland to identify the Western civilization ethic with Christianity, and therefore started sort of cozying up to Christianity as a defense mechanism against Islamism and wokeism and Putin and China? Well, we know that this is the result in at least some cases, because who here's read Ayaan Hirsi Ali's conversion story in Unheard? Has anybody sat down and read it? If you've read it, you'll notice that she mentions Richard Dawkins more than she mentions Jesus Christ. She talks about Putin, she talks about China, she talks about Islamism, she talks about wokeism. She at one point finally says, but I would be lying to say, or mistaken to say, or misleading to say that my conversion is solely due to political considerations. And you think, okay, finally, we'll get to hear the more confessional side. She says she was also dealing with a depth of nihilism. And then in something like the next paragraph says, in this nihilistic vacuum, we have no way to combat our menacing foes of China and Russia. And so in trying to explain a non-political reason for becoming a Christian, she circles immediately back to a political reason. Now, she's welcome to do that. And listening to her speak in New York more recently, it seems that she has actually developed a conviction and belief in God, but she did seem to suggest that she chooses to believe the truth claims because she's so attracted to the other stuff. That's great. I wish I could do that. That would be wonderful for me. But unfortunately, I find myself unable to make such a jump. But I'm happy for her, just to be clear. I would never say she's not a Christian. I have no doubt that she believes these things. But the way in seems to be political. And Ayaan is an outlier here because she's someone who will say, no, I actually do believe this to be true. Whereas all of the other thinkers are very careful to qualify their statements in saying, well, of course I don't believe that this is true. I don't really believe that Jesus rose from the dead. But I'm kind of sad about the fact that, Christianity is dying in this country. That's a political statement. And it's a statement that Nietzsche said. So it's not, I would agree with Justin's second thesis, in other words, that new atheism has grown old. But it's not that it's so much grown old, it's just become old again. Now atheists are just saying the same thing they've been saying for centuries before new atheism, that yes, God is dead, but that's kind of a bad thing again, because the Enlightenment secular humanist project that was promised alongside, sort of riding alongside these unforgivingly rational critiques of religion in the sidecar was this sort of, and we're going to replace it with reason and rationalism. That's the one thing Ayaan Hirsi Ali is right about, by the way, I think, is she says that this vacuum that was created was not filled, as promised by Bertrand Russell, with sort of secular Enlightenment thinking and a sort of a new hope that you can discover for your life somehow by like looking at a microscope or learning a fact about evolutionary biology. Clearly doesn't work like that. That's certainly true. I have no doubt. So people are beginning to sort of see how society goes when we try the secularism stuff on the size. But the Nietzschean problem is that we've now convinced everybody that God doesn't exist. And you can't just talk yourself out of that. But we're beginning to realize that actually maybe there was a reason that this noble lie was sort of constructed in the first place. So if there's a rebirth of anything, I think it's a rebirth of, the utility of religion. That's a much easier thing to argue for in my case than any indication that people are actually going to start believing in God again. And even if they do, I think it'll be a sort of Ayaan Hirsi Ali style approach of saying that I'm so upset with the way that the world is going that I'd sooner, as Dostoevsky once wrote in a letter to his friend, if you could prove that all of the facts lay outside of Christ, I'd sooner reject the facts and throw myself in with Christ then reject Christ and throw myself in with the facts. And I think that that's probably a lot of what we're seeing. As in, I think that's what's going on to some degree.
Justin, would you like to respond? Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to potentially respond to there. And I agree with some of what you're saying there, Alex. I think a lot of the examples I do point to in the book and talk about on the podcast are these secular intellectuals who certainly have not necessarily converted to Christianity. They're people who are saying, like, as you say, Douglas Murray, well, I really like what Christianity gives us. I can't buy into it myself at a kind of supernatural level. Having said that, I think there's a spectrum of people. There's the kind of, it's really useful people on one end. There's the people who are kind of, it's really useful and I'm really attracted to it, sort of somewhere further along the spectrum. There's the people who feel like they're almost tipped into becoming Christians. And I'd actually include someone like Tom Holland, who, you know, when I had a public dialogue with him a few months ago, was absolutely open about the fact he goes to church and he's a communicant Anglican now, and he believes that God maybe did a miracle in his life as well. So I think I wouldn't say that all of the examples are actually just these sort of cynical, we just need the utility of religion and we're not going to actually believe it. I think there's a lot of people are going on a very interesting journey. Often it's preceded by these sort of social, intellectual, cultural concerns. And I think Ayaan Hirsi Ali is a good example of that. I can fully imagine that to some extent it was those political, cultural things that kind of reoriented her towards the possibility of the value of Christianity. But evidently, as you say, there's also this very deeply personal story, which she talked about, you know, in that recent dialogue in New York that you're talking about. And it's interesting there because when Freddie Sayers had her on stage and asked her about her journey, she didn't start with the political stuff. She started immediately with, well, I was broken and desperate and alcoholic, and God reached in, basically, and did a miracle. And so I've no reason to doubt her story, whatever route it took for her to get there, because, you know, I believe that, you know, God draws straight with crooked lines. There's all kinds of bad motives why people might become Christians, not ideal motives, but that's the whole point of grace, as far as I'm concerned. That's, you know, people come in all kinds of different ways. So I'm not... Now, I absolutely agree, though, if this were a movement that was actually just about this political stuff, about this utility of religion, then I think that's going nowhere, because ultimately that's putting the cart before the horse. For me, the reason Christianity, and we might want to come to debate this in itself, but the reason I believe Christianity has essentially, in that Tom Holland thesis way, given us our moral imagination and instincts in the West, is because people believed it was true and they went out and lived life in the way Jesus had asked them to, often very imperfectly, but it was believing it and practicing it that led to the culture we have. It wasn't that people went out to say, we are going to create a culture in which we have human rights, democracy, progress, freedom, and everything else. It was just that happened as they lived this life that had been kind of demonstrated for them in Jesus. And so if you then try and sort of encourage people to do those things by sort of just saying, let's just kind of instill these Christian values without there being actually a genuine heart thing that happens to lead people in that direction, then yeah, it's going to falter. It's going to sputter out. But the reason I believe there is a surprising rebirth of belief in God is precisely because I think people are recognizing that the kind of secular atheist materialist project, which has been so dominant in our culture up till now, and its kind of high point was the new atheism. It's the fact that I'm meeting so many people, former atheists, who are now questioning that. People who aren't necessarily identifying as Christians, but they're certainly saying, I'm a lapsed atheist. And for me, that's kind of halfway along that spectrum to God at that point. And I feel like a lot of people are teetering on the edge, kind of almost just waiting for some intellectual or experiential permission. And that's what I do find, Jordan Peterson, I don't know where exactly he stands. Now, when you interviewed him, it sounded like, I don't know if this was your take on it, that and I really appreciated actually you asking the questions that everyone wants him to answer about the resurrection, and stop talking in purely metaphorical terms. Do you believe this stuff or not? And what I heard was, well, on balance, yeah, I think Jesus maybe did walk out of the tomb. And that's interesting. That's movement. But regardless of his specific beliefs, I encounter so many people who, because of what he has been saying on stages around the world and on YouTube, it's given them permission to take Christianity seriously. And I know a lot of people who have walked through the door. So again, I'm not saying this is showing up in the census at this point. It absolutely isn't. But this is my final point before I hand it back to you. I'm intrigued by the fact that I think when I wrote the book, I didn't have any statistics to say there is a rebirth on the way in terms of people actually starting to go to church again or anything. I bumped into a lot more recently of what could be signs of that. So surveys among young people, this has been done by a number of different organizations in the US and here. Far more openness to spirituality and God than older generations, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z. It feels like they're primed to believe in something. Now, it may not be the Christian God they come back to, but there's a hunger, a spiritual thirst. I had an interview the other day with an organization called Fusion, who run a lot of Christian unions across the country, or engage with students, and they said they are seeing an openness they have never witnessed in the last 20 years on campuses. Young people interested in God, open to going to church, that kind of thing. So there's something happening. I genuinely think that's not just anecdotal. There's hard evidence that things are happening. There's these statistics I've quoted a couple of times in Finland, this weird anomaly that the number of young men going to church doubled, more than doubled in the space of a few years. And all kinds of other little markers that I'm hearing that, again, I haven't sat down and done a kind of complete analysis of that, but I think it's more than just a few weird secular intellectuals talking nicely about God. I genuinely think that there's a genuine push against secular material atheism and this kind of openness. Now, will that result in churches like this being filled to capacity in 10 years? I can't make that prediction, but something is changing.
Yeah, it'd be interesting if we could fill out a church, but God couldn't, wouldn't it? I think you said a few times how secular material atheism, I think these need to be teased apart. For example, when you said a second ago that studies show that young people are more open to God and spirituality, I'd like to see those teased apart, because I can find no shortage of people who will say, yeah, I don't know if I'm like an atheist, because like, how do you know, So I think there might be something. And invariably, when you press someone on what the something is, they don't really know, which is fine. But they sort of have this idea that, well, it can't just be like matter in motion, which is fair enough. In fact, basically every single civilization that we come across, anthropologically speaking, has some kind of sense of the numinous, has some sense of the sacred and the profane. Whether this sort of transforms into God, I think, is another question. Also, yes, you're right. I mean, it is anecdotal. I mean, you say that you're meeting a lot more people who are telling you that they're considering Christianity again. You have to consider the line of work that you're in, Justin. I mean, I meet a lot of people who say the same thing in the other direction. I'm probably less happy about that. When someone comes to me and say, hey, I had this sort of, this grand ethic that was underlying my life and giving it meaning, and then I listened to your video and I don't think that's true anymore. Awesome. Yeah, brilliant. That's great. But it is happening in the same sense, hearing people say, look, I'm just seeing people come to church in a way that I've not seen before. If you go onto any university campus and speak to professors, what do they say about the sort of shifting tide of the nation? They'll say, gosh, I've never seen anything like this before. Young people are becoming woke. They're becoming super left-wing. There are people like protesting speakers who want to come and talk about whether it be something to do with being pro-life or whether it be something to do with the nation or whatever it is. These people are not Christians. The kind of, in fact, I think a lot of the essence that underlies that is in many ways anti-Christian. So it sort of depends where you're looking as to what you're going to see. It depends what room you're in as to what the air is going to smell like. You know what I mean? And so,
can I make a quick response to that? So we're sharing a mic, so it's a bit.
Yeah. Do we have a third mic?
Yeah.
Did it break?
There is a third mic, because that is. You're absolutely right.
You don't need to hear from me.
I don't want you to feel, superfluous.
There's a kind of selection bias, obviously, with the people I'm meeting right now.
Yeah.
I'm hosting a podcast called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, so people are coming out the woodwork. But let's not forget, I also hosted a show where I brought Christians and atheists on for 17 years, and I genuinely have seen a change. The way that people talk about God now is not the way they were talking about God 10, 15 years ago. So something has changed.
Do you
I'm
mean
certain of that?
Do you mean like they're talking differently about belief in God? That is, they're sort of saying like, yeah, no, I sort of, I'm not really an atheist anymore, in the sense that they are sort of convinced by certain arguments that God's existent? Or do you just mean that they're more sort of soft and lukewarm on the sort of social criticism? Because I completely agree with that. People are much less commonly saying religion is this evil, horrible force that needs to be deconstructed.
I think the kind of the new atheist rhetoric has dialed down a lot in a lot of people, and that's still there. On Facebook, you'll find the new atheist sort of stuff coming thick and fast if you mention God in public. But on a more kind of general level, I just think people are no longer sort of taking that line. But it is more than that. I genuinely am meeting more and more people who are saying, well, I was a Richard Dawkins kind of atheist, and I'm now kind of seriously don't take that approach anymore. And I'm really interested in Christianity. And again, I don't have as hard statistics on this. It's just that I wasn't meeting nearly as many of those people, and I was primed to potentially meet them in the role I had, and yet now it feels like I meet them all the time.
Would you consider me one of those people?
Not in quite the same way,
because I could quite easily say, when I first discovered Richard Dawkins and was making these videos on YouTube, I was a very Richard Dawkins style atheism, but now I'm not that kind of atheist. Definitely not. I don't like the sort of the new atheist approach. I'm way less convinced of this religion is bad type stuff, and I'm taking Christianity very seriously. I did a degree in theology, etc., and I still loved like biblical scholarship, and I listened to Jordan Peterson, and but like I'm still me, right? I'm still here on the other side of this conversation. I feel like a lot of people you speak to must still, when you sort of push them against the wall and say, but do you believe it? They still say no.
Yes, obviously, there's a lot of people who haven't dived in. But I mean, you're an super interesting example, Alex, because you've definitely gone on a kind of evolution in terms of the way you interact with these issues. I think there are some arguments for faith and Christianity that you take more seriously than you used to, and everything else. But absolutely, you haven't become a Christian at this point, of course not. But I do see people going a bit further than this, who just haven't come from the sort of same intellectual kind of debate kind of background that you come from, who are much more just sort of have imbibed, if you like, in the sort of, from growing up really, a kind of generally skeptical, secular, materialistic kind of attitude to life and God and faith, and who now just have started to genuinely question that. And literally a young man walked into our church the other week who said, I'm an atheist, or I think I am. I'm not sure I am actually. And he said, because I basically was doing the Richard Dawkins thing, absolutely didn't believe in God, think religion's bad for us, but I've just had this weird experience over the last month, and I just needed to go to a church. And that is not like, that's one of many, many stories that I'm bumping into, and other church leaders telling me about these people, lots of young men coming into churches. Some of them have been listening to Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson. So something's happening. And it is this thing of, I think, they've sort of been given intellectual permission to think differently about life. And not all of them have become Christians by any stretch, but some of them have. And like that's what I'm kind of trying to get at. Something has changed.
Do a lot of them tend to be disaffected young men?
Arguably, some of them will be.
Because I think I wouldn't disagree with you that kind of thing happens all the time. I'm interested to hear what you think about, for example, let's say other religious traditions can do the same thing. What you end up with, I think, is... I mean, I've spoken about politics here. I've said that there are your sort of secular intellectuals who are upset politically with the state of the country, but most people they don't have the luxury to be thinking about that kind of stuff. They're thinking about their own life, and they're sort of getting a bit nihilistic. This is the sort of materialism, spiritual bit that I think that there's a sort of equal force of this sort of nihilism that strikes up in people. I mean, a lot of people have been told for a long time now, nothing really matters. The things that were important don't really... I do think this is somehow downstream from politics. The same kind of force which politically liberalizes and says, do whatever you want as long as you're not harming anybody else. We're secular, so we're sort of hands off and you can sort of do what you want and no one's really right or wrong. We're just going to let people sort of intermingle. Sort of downstream from that is the philosophical version of that, which is that well, nothing's really important. Nothing matters. There's nothing that's true. Anything that I care about, someone else cares about it, its negation. And there's nothing to tell me which of those is true or false. And they're sort of feeling a bit disaffected. And then someone comes along and says, hey, that feeling you've been having, that's not quite right? That actually, no, you do believe certain things are true. And a lot of the time, this has got to do with gender roles or standing up for yourself or whatever it might be. And people go, yeah, you know what? And they say, well, guess what? I've got this pre-packaged ideology. If you sort of join our team, you can suddenly confidently say these things with a chorus of people who agree with you behind you, with an entire philosophical tradition to back it up. How about that? Of course, that's going to be attractive to disaffected young people who sort of don't really have a place to go. Now, again, if this doesn't say that it's not true, it could be the case that Christianity is true, and that's why when people start throwing it off, they start to feel very disaffected. It's possible, but I still think that the motivation here is less theological than we'd like to sort of label it a Christian revival.
Let me understand this a bit more then, because what motivation would be this motivation that would validate this movement in your view? I guess, like I said earlier, people potentially come to faith for all kinds of reasons.
Yeah.
Very rarely, actually, are they purely intellectual, theologically driven reasons. It's usually because they're experiencing some kind of personal, spiritual, mental crisis.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that's absolutely what is happening in our culture. I think there is this meaning crisis. And a lot of people who are holding on to the hope that the kind of atheist materialist thing might offer some answers have been let down. It feels like those were empty promises. And so, yeah, I think that's absolutely driving people back to, as you say, kind of the package. But the package is attractive because it's been proven to work, I think, and that's why people are open to it. I don't think that's an invalid reason for people to start to investigate.
For example, I mean, the book title or the book subtitle, Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. In this country, not only is Islam growing faster than Christianity, it's growing and Christianity is shrinking. So I think, it might be the case that secular atheist materialism isn't really doing it for people. But what that's telling me is that people sort of need to believe in some kind of impenetrable authority that they can refer to when they're confused about what's right and wrong and they don't know where else to turn. Also, those moral intuitions that they hold, they want some authority to refer to sort of justify those intuitions. They want a community of people who they can spend time with and agree with about the way the world is and the way the world should run. Sure, people are attracted to that, but it seems like, at least in our country, the statistics are showing us that that's not being borne out in Christianity.
Well, as I say, it's early days. I wonder whether we might be due for something happening on that front, which is why I think these early signs of interest might... Again, it is anecdotal, but at Easter, story after story of church leaders just on WhatsApp groups texting me saying, we had our biggest ever Easter celebration this year. We've had more baptisms than we've had in years in the past year. Even in France, Catholic baptism, adult baptisms in the Catholic Church are at an all-time high. When enough of that stuff happens, it suggests that something is happening in Christianity. Now, I'll agree, Islam has been on the rise in the UK and elsewhere for a long time. And if the current statistics continue in the way they are, yeah, at some point Islam will become bigger than Christianity. Now, that's if things carry on the way they are. And I absolutely agree with your point that this could just as easily be a phenomenon that captures the minds of people who are looking for something to live for in Islam. And I've absolutely met young men who have come through to Islam, have been, evangelized on TikTok, and they're looking for something to make sense of their lives, a community, something that validated who they could be. And yeah, and Islam kind of was the thing that... So I'm not in any way saying this is uniquely Christian, but having said that, in the public space, the people who seem to be appealing to something in terms of these intellectuals tend to be appealing to Christianity, not to Islam. And I think that's because they do recognize that if you want the benefits of Western culture, it's obviously been built on Christianity, not Islam.
Thanks to Gareth, who wrote in to say, whether you're a person of faith, agnostic, atheist, or none of the above, this series is both genuinely thought-provoking and inspiring. I could not recommend it highly enough. Leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts or simply posting about us on your social media helps others to discover the show. If you want to follow more of my work, why not get my fortnightly newsletter? I'll even send you the first chapter of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God book for free when you subscribe. And if you'd like to support the show, you can get early access episodes and bonus content. Gold supporters will receive signed copies of both my books. For the newsletter and to support, visit justinbrierley.com or the links with today's show.
So to ask the question, the next question perhaps is difficult if you have a disagreement upon what is actually happening. So I guess if we just kind of call it X, whatever it is that's happening, whether it's I think perhaps we could agree on there's a shift in the kinds of conversations happening and the ways in which the conversations are.
I would also just add that where I've sort of tied this to a political movement that I've said sort of occupies political right, like it's pretty undeniable there is a rise of a certain new kind of right-wing politics happening currently. I mean, right now, certainly happening across Europe and in the United Kingdom, where I'll sort of, I mean, what are Reform UK behind the Tories in the latest polls, like 1 or 2 points, like that, there's sort of non-negligible chance that Nigel Farage might be the leader of the opposition. It's it shows me that like it obviously the country is sort of moving more left in the sense that Labour is more popular, but Labour is so popular because they've moved the party right, and the people who are on the right are now sort of considering reform. Across Europe, the recent elections have shown us that there is some kind of rise of the right wing. So I just wanted to add to the thesis that if Christianity is sort of loosely tied in this sort of vague a la carte way to like right-wing politics, then the rise of right-wing politics would also help to explain the rise of cozying up to Christianity.
Makes sense. So we'll start with you on this one, Alex. How you understand this sort of shift of the tides, if we can at least call it that. Is this something to celebrate, or is it not? And then we'll go to Justin after that.
I suppose it depends on the fruits. Like I've said a moment ago, I sort of started out agreeing with this whole, religion is bad. I've realized that saying religion is bad is like saying politics is bad. It's kind of an unthinking statement. It's like, everyone, you say, oh, politics, it causes so many wars. It drives families apart, and throughout history, think of all of the harm that's been caused by politics. Like, it's a bit naive because that doesn't exclude the possibility of there being a correct political choice, right? And so I feel like religion is or should be considered similarly. So maybe, I mean, I do like, as I said a moment ago, the reason that I'm an interesting case, it seems, is because, I quite like Christianity. It's got some very nice ethical statements. Some of them actually quite radical. Famously, the loving of enemies, I think, is a genuinely radical moral command that if you genuinely internalize, I think genuinely makes the world a better place, right? So, sure, I would say that it depends on the kind of Christianity, because we increasingly hear the term Judeo-Christian as well recently, and if I actually flip open and look at the scriptures, I look at what Jesus said most of the time, pretty good. I can get behind that. I look at what the Old Testament God was getting up to, and I'm not so much a fan, especially, undertones with our current world conflict, when you have stories in the Old Testament of God saying, I'm going to promise you this land, and yes, there may already be inhabitants. We're just going to sort of go in and let's just see if they'll leave. And if they don't, then we'll chase them into wilderness, and then we'll kill them, and then we'll turn around and kill their women and children and their animals too. I'm not so sure. In other words, I don't know. It depends on the kind of Christianity that springs up, because you can just as easily refer to gentle Jesus, meek and mild, when you want to make the case that Christianity ought to be this sort of lukewarm, laid back, sort of let's all be nice to each other kind of religion. But if there's a political necessity, it's very easy to flip open to other passages too, which say, no, you've got to sort of, take up arms, which has happened historically too. So if the rise of Christianity, if there is such a thing, again, statistically not, but if it does happen in the next 10 years, 20 years, if this does have something to do with the way of the world, that is a political reason, if it does have something to do, as Ian and seemingly people like Douglas and arguably Jordan too, that's sort of implying, then the kind of Christianity that returns might be, as I said before at our event at Unheard, might be the kind of strong-armed, aggressive, arrogant Christianity that we know has existed historically, and when it has existed historically, we've been quite right to criticize and condemn. So we must be careful. I don't know if it's going to be a good thing. It depends what kind of Christianity emerges. There are as many kinds of Christianities as there are Christians, and so it's hard to say. It's impossible to say. I just think we should be careful.
Perhaps it's a good point to ask this, and then I'll give Justin a chance to respond to both. So the so what now? So I think it naturally leads on to this point in particular of, if Christianity is on the rise, what kind? So if you had a word for the church and for the unchurched in the room, what would it be in light of the conversation thus far?
I'd say, try to pay close attention to the reasons that are really motivating your beliefs and behaviors. Justin has pointed out that most people don't change their worldviews based on rational argumentation. That's not an insult. It's true. We know that people are affected by their environment. We know that if you lock yourself in a room with nothing but a Bible and a bunch of Christians, you're probably going to become a Christian. It's how human beings work. We're sort of social creatures who are more impressionable than we like to let on, especially when we say, I like to spend time with people who disagree with me. Like, seriously? I mean, you might spend some time with an atheist, maybe a nice atheist, but when was the last time you really sat down and spent a lot of time with someone who really disagrees with you? I mean, really, and not a family member at the dinner table that you're forced to. I mean, gone in with the intention of having a conversation and getting to the bottom of it with someone who really, really disagrees with you. You know what I mean? Like, on something seriously important, It happens far more rarely than we like to let on. And people say, I encountered them on social media. Social media is algorithmically curated to present people that you enjoy interacting with, even if it's to argue with. So it is not going to give you the kind of people that you need to argue with, because the kind of people you need to argue with are the people who are going to frustrate you. And social media is designed from the ground up in a more intelligent way than we could even possibly hope to comprehend to not do that. It's not happening, right? So I would suggest, trying to encounter and talk to some people like that. But the what now thing, it really depends on what actually happens. Because, as Justin says, what we have is an anecdotal thesis that Christianity might be about to make a comeback. If it does, then we'll see what happens. And if it doesn't, then I imagine that, things will either continue to decline in terms of Christian belief, or maybe they'll sort of bottom out and hop around for a bit. But historically speaking, I think people believe things and then they don't. Societies go left-wing and then they go right-wing. Societies are very sort of liberal about sex and then they're very closed about sex. I mean, we talk about the sort of arc of history as if we're sort of on this constant trajectory towards this moral truth or whatever. Like, people will say, I can't believe that somebody's homophobic because it's like they're living in the 1950s. As if this sort of arc of history that culminates in the 1950s and suddenly people stop being homophobic. No, there are societies dotted throughout the whole of human history that have been totally okay with having sex with whoever you want, and then not okay, and then okay with it, and then not okay, and okay with it. And societies just sort of ebb and flow in that way. And so think that, if we see the tide come in, then it goes out again, and then it comes in again, and then it goes out again. And then that's probably what's happening. I don't think there's anything particularly special about the current moment, except that it's done online in a way that people can broadcast and interact with people from halfway across the globe who believe equal and opposite things.
Wonderful. I'll give Justin a chance now. So there's two questions. Apologize to do this to you. So is this something to celebrate? And maybe for you, is it something to celebrate yet, or, is there more work to be done?
Well, I want to just firstly agree with a lot of what Alex has just said, actually, because I do think it's too early to say what exactly we would be celebrating. I think this could go in some troubling directions. If Alex is correct that this is really a phenomenon that's just about right-wing political people co-opting Christianity for this purpose, then I don't want that. That is not what Christianity is about. I happen to think that a lot of the people with the platforms right now talking happen to be right of centre for all kinds of reasons. But it's interesting. I do think this spiritual thirst, hunger thing is across the board. So it's just that you don't necessarily hear from people who are more on the left as frequently as you do from people on the right in that way. But in the conversation we had with Elizabeth Oldfield, she talked about the fact that she's engaging with a lot of people across the spectrum who are, whatever their political perspectives, they're looking for, they're tired of the materialist account of reality. And it might be that they're into psychedelics and they're looking in that way. It might be that they've got huge environmental concerns, and that has kind of triggered their particular kind of search for meaning and purpose, because they've realized we can't solve this problem ourselves. We need a spiritual solution. So I think that it is more nuanced than perhaps you've described, or even than my book describes, because I will absolutely admit the book does tend to major on some of those more sort of high-profile individuals like the Jordan Petersons and the Douglas Murrays and so on. So the question of whether we celebrate this is, I would only want to celebrate this if it's in my opinion, true Christianity. And that is the kind of Christianity that absolutely goes to that fundamental command of love your enemies. It is completely countercultural. Now, that's not necessarily going to be a vote winner, actually. So I don't see this necessarily, if it's going to happen in its true form, being, married to some populist government thing. I don't think it will be in the end. I think there will be versions of it that are associated with that, and you can see that in the rise of some forms of Christian nationalism and that kind of thing in the US. But my genuine belief is that whatever those are, they're not Christianity. They're just another form of idolatry, basically, that is you co-opting Christianity for a political purpose. I'm interested in the stories that I am seeing of people who, maybe there are some political motivations in the background, but who are coming to that point of realizing politics isn't going to solve this. Just kind of throwing more technology or science or whatever at this it's a problem of the human heart. And I do genuinely think more and more people are kind of coming to the end of their tether in that sense. And so I don't know is the answer. The only thing I will celebrate is people being absolutely transformed by Jesus Christ and going and changing the world in the way those first Christians did. I suppose the reason I'm hopeful, optimistic that is what the end game will be is because I'm a Christian, because I do believe in a God who works through renewing, revitalizing, reviving his church, even though it so often goes off course, gets into all kinds of mistakes and muddles. I think history is basically a long series of points at which God has stepped in and done something new, and something genuine, Christ-like has emerged out of it. We are in a long trough at the moment of this secular moment in the West. But I guess I just believe that the wave is coming back. And because I'm a Christian, I believe there's going to be good fruit from that. There's going to be a lot of other stuff that it might wash in as well. There might be all kinds of other religious beliefs, all kinds of esoteric New Age stuff that comes in. There might be all kinds of political stuff that comes in. That will all happen, I'm sure. But I think there will be something of genuine Christianity that also breaks through, because I guess that's where my faith comes in.
Yeah, we've talked a bit about popular figures now, particularly that come from the right of center, and perhaps started on this journey in I don't know where they are at this point in their heart of hearts. But do you have examples? I know reading your book, you have a few stories of people who came at it from particularly literary figures who came at it from non-political ways. Do you have a couple of those we'd like to reference?
Yeah. I mean, there's plenty to choose from. But yeah, there's been some really interesting individuals. Paul Kingsnorth is a good example of this, someone who was a celebrated author and poet, very much involved in the environmental activism, ecology movement. It was partly, I think, he kind of got so disillusioned in many ways with the direction in which the environmental movement went. I think he realized that you can't solve these issues in purely material ways. And he started to look for kind of spiritual solutions. And he sort of, having gone through a sort of teenage atheist phase, he went through a long period as a Buddhist, trying to find kind of enlightenment from within, if you like. But he says he always felt drawn to worship something. He loved nature. He loved being out and in the woods and the mountains. And he tried Wicca for several years. He literally did the nature worship thing. But again, he found it was actually a kind of pagan Christian heresy mashup. And to his great surprise, just a few years ago, he found himself being drawn into the Christian faith. He says he even sort of, before he became a Christian, his wife told him over dinner, "You're going to become a Christian," completely out of the blue. She wasn't a Christian herself. And he said, "Don't be ridiculous." But a couple of years later, he found that he had become a Christian, and it was lots of different things that led him to that point. But he says he was kind of a whole set of circumstances that sort of pulled him kicking and screaming, he says, out of Wicca. And he was one of these sort of C.S. Lewis type reluctant converts. But once he saw it, once he realized what Christianity really was, rather than the thing he thought it was, he suddenly realized he'd come home to what he'd been looking for the whole time. So that's just one really interesting story. And a lot of his audience were very surprised at this sudden adult conversion of Paul Kingsnorth. again, that's not someone who fits this kind of right-wing political mold. In fact, he's quite worried about where that's all going. Another person you could mention is Francis Spufford, who's another celebrated kind of author, prize-winning author, who, again, sort of was in a kind of atheist mindset for many years as an adult, having sort of had a nominal Anglican upbringing. And then a set of personal life circumstances led to the point where he realized he just needed grace. He needed to be able to give his sin, or as he calls it, the human propensity to things up, to God. And that was it. And suddenly the light bulb came on, it clicked, and he suddenly found the thing he'd been looking for. So these are, obviously, again, they're anecdotal. These are just in, a couple of individuals. But as I say, I feel like the number of those I'm bumping into, of these surprising adult converts, is quite interesting.
So if you could see a quick word on the sort of so what or what next. I know you have 3 points in your book. I don't know if you want to hit those 3 points briefly. I particularly like the keep Christianity weird one. And then I'll give Alex a time. I know we've let you talk for a while, then I'll let Alex respond.
Yeah, so just when I wanted to finish the book with maybe a kind of a what next for Christians, arguably, who are reading the book and wondering, well, if there is something happening, how can we lean into this? Three simple suggestions, I think. First one I make is we need to inspire people's imagination again. I spent many years hosting a show which was basically apologetics, giving intellectual arguments for God. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I just want to put on record that when I say most people don't come to faith through those arguments, that's true. That doesn't mean there aren't good intellectual arguments for Christianity. I think that's the beauty of Christianity. It speaks to the head and the heart. But I do think we need to get back into speaking to the heart, because too often I think we've kind of fallen into a trap laid by the Enlightenment, by the new atheists, that we have to basically, only if we can logically prove God to someone, have we done our job. As Alex has said, that's not the way most people actually believe anything. We believe things through intuition, through a gut feeling, through our environment, and all kinds of things. And I just think it's important for the church to tell the story well as point them to historical facts or philosophical arguments. So there's that. Keep Christianity weird. A lot of these people who are really interested in Christianity have said to me, what the worst thing that the church can do is try to basically just look as much like the culture as possible. I can get that already. Why would I go to church just to be told exactly the same things as I'm hearing in the culture? The Paul Kingsnorths, the Tom Hollands, the thing that's attracting them to Christianity is the kind of mysteriousness of it, the weirdness, the otherness. It's no accident that Tom Holland goes to the oldest church in London. It's because he loves the sense of mystery and awe, something that you can't rationalize at one level. Same for Paul Kingsnorth, who's gone into the Eastern Orthodox tradition. It speaks in a different way. And that might be true as well at an ethical level as well, that actually if we just kind of dilute everything down to the level of the culture, then you become invisible at one level. And that's, we kind of sometimes think, let's be so seeker-friendly that, no one would ever take any offense at us. Actually, I think Christianity grew in the first century because it was so different to the culture. And so we shouldn't forget that. And thirdly is just that in this era of cancel culture, politicization, tribalism online, all of that stuff that's just eating our culture at the moment, the church has to have a different kind of witness. We've got to be a place where both sides can come together, where we have this space of grace to allow people to be who they are, to hold up the truth as we see it, but to give space for people to have their questions, not be shouted down. Or we just need to create this kind of community that counters cancel culture, essentially, where if we're going to see meaning seekers coming back to church, I think we have to do it with the kind of grace that Jesus himself modeled. You've got one.
I agree that, we've spoken a few times, I think, about the abandonment of the propositional, the idea that people are these reason machines that sort of think things out, and that's not only how they do come to believe things, but how they should come to believe things. I think the main thing that's been abandoned, and I think probably responsible, maybe not responsible, maybe a direct result, whatever this sort of shift in the air that you're describing, I do feel something like a shift towards a favouring of narrative and non-propositional thinking over the propositional, logical, sort of, like the logical fallacy stuff. Well, technically that commits it. Like, no one really cares anymore about that kind of thing in my experience in the conversation.
Only the real nerds.
Yeah, but, like, it's like that stuff isn't as attractive to a wider audience, I think, because when you first sort of come across it, you think, oh, here's a really useful tool. And then you realize that it's a useful tool for sort of deconstructing an argument, but not for, constructing anything to actually live on. And
Can I ask you something? Because I've been desperate to ask you this.
please,
I feel like
I'm quite worried. We could do this afterwards.
I've noticed even in the last few months, a bit of a shift in tone with some of the things you're saying. And then I just happened to hear you talking about the fact you've taken psychedelics recently and the effect that had on you at a personal level. Now, you said in this brief commentary on it that this was a very personal thing, not a kind of objective experience that you could describe, but very subjective. But I couldn't help thinking, what you just described, this move towards a more narrative, imaginative way of, has that in any way been influenced by this experience you've had on psychedelics?
Oh, that's very possible. I've wondered that myself. I mean, I spoke about it recently, but it's not. I mean, it was quite a long time ago now that I first tried psychedelics. What psychedelics do is the revelation that you'll have with a psychedelic drug. I spoke to John Vervaeke about this on my podcast, and he seemed to suggest that there was some literature that pointed to the same. Maybe I'm mistaking that, but the thing that's interesting is not what you see, but that you're seeing it. It's not so much a revelation that you sort of think of some idea or see some vision or something and you go, wow, there it is, that's amazing. It's sort of the fact that your brain can do that. You suddenly realize that your entire way of interacting with the world can just crumble. For this, you take like a tiny little piece of paper and you put it on your tongue and your entire world collapses around you. The fact that the brain is capable of doing that, and drugs, as Sam Harris has said, drugs don't do anything. They don't give your brain anything that isn't already there. It just sort of changes the process. It speeds things up, holds things back, right? Everything that's working is just your brain doing stuff in different ways. It's all actually there all the time. It's just that you sort of have this realization that the brain is capable of far much more than you originally thought, including capable of making you believe and see and feel certain things outside of the sort of normal way of thinking. So it would be no surprise to me if that played some role, but I couldn't identify it with it. Like I've thought about it. Like I was, I go from sort of being a teenager to not a teenager. I go from being someone with a small public platform to a growing public platform. You take psychedelic drugs. I go to university and I meet lots of people who disagree with me and make me look like an idiot in the pub during arguments. Like any one of these things could be principally responsible. So I wouldn't want to say so, but it definitely does something special. I mean, in particular, I do feel like I've got a better appreciation for art, and that art, that sort of right-brained way of thinking must be unlocked.
I guess I wondered,
like that.
Is it the close, because you've done a lot of thinking about God and about religion and in the intellectual arguments. Was it the closest thing potentially to a religious experience that you've had, or what you think might be a religious?
I wouldn't say so. Unfortunately, I certainly wouldn't use any kind of religious terminology. I mean, when I say it was sort of private and personal, I don't mean because I had some sort of interaction with God or something. I just mean because the interactions that I were having were shared with friends, and they were about things that other people wouldn't even sort of understand because they don't know the relationship that I have with those people. But certainly, I mean, listening to music like I'd never heard it before, realizing that there are like worlds to discover inside the normal, mundane, everyday things, that was important. I wouldn't describe it as religious if you like, but the fact that you can plan, you can say, oh, it's going to be really cool. What I'm going to do is I'm going to line up a bunch of music I want to listen to. I've got this really cool, trippy photo that I think would be really cool to look at, and then when like 3 hours later, you find yourself far more interested by like the carpet than anything you could have imagined, and you think, good. And the thing that remains, I mean, the main thing that I thought when the first time I was sort of walking down on a fairly low dose of 2CB was that, the world is very beautiful, but it wasn't that it had suddenly become beautiful. It was that it had always been very beautiful, but I was only just beginning to notice it, right? So there was this thing about the world that was non-propositional, which I felt like had always been true, but I'd just sort of been able to realize it. That sounds a bit religious, right? Because a lot of people describe their belief in God in that way, but it just didn't attach itself to any kind of spiritual entity. It was just attached to the sort of pretty green tree.
I apologize for the diversion, but I was just really fascinated to ask that.
Yeah,
That's quite all right.
but the abandonment of the propositional is maybe a result of that, but also something that's a common story amongst like a lot of things. If you look closely enough, people realize that it's not the way to interact with God, if there is a way to interact with God. Do not all charms fly at the mere touch of cold philosophy, as Keats says. Philosophy will clip an angel's wings, conquer all mysteries by rule and line, empty the haunted air, and no mid-mind. Like this idea that there's this sort of place for it. There's a tool to be used, but it's not. It's not the way of getting at it. There's a wonderful poem that I talked about in this event at New York. Same one where Ian spoke to Richard Dawkins, although there were probably less people in the audience at that point. C.S. Lewis has a poem called The Apologist's Evening Prayer. I say it's a poem, it's more of a prayer.
Yeah.
You've come across it?
Yes.
And here's C.S. Lewis saying that I'm this sort of big shot apologist who has all of these rational arguments for the existence of God, but actually I need to remind myself every night that that's not the approach that I should be taking. It's a wonderful poem that a friend of mine introduced to me, because it does as much for the atheist as it does for the Christian. The Christian is reminded that actually people don't come to believe in God through reason and argument in that way, and that's not how it should be done. But for the atheist, they can also say, see, I told you that this was not about the arguments that you have sort of been claiming that it was. You know what I mean?
Thank you. I do feel a slight responsibility after that conversation to say the views spoken here do not necessarily reflect the views of Trinity Forum Europe. Just kidding.
Yeah.
Psychedelics.
Don't
This
do
is
it.
not an endorsement.
It was awful. It was terrible. It was horrible.
But I am glad that we can host a conversation on such things. Thank you both so far. I resonate and being inspired by so much of this conversation so far. I'm reminded, just listening to you, I'm reminded of Pascal's words, make good men wish it was true and then show that it is.
I was waiting for that. to come out.
It's a classic line. You can read the full thing in the... I'm always getting nervous trying to say French words. Pensée.
It's an irony that you can't say pensée without sounding a bit poncy.
Very fair. Alex, thank you as well for your contribution so far. Really resonate with your comment, particularly on the end on beauty. Myself, I was studying apologetics at Biola University when I went to an intense period of doubt. I was actually staring at a painting, not even a very good painting, but a painting of a clownfish. Kind of reminded me of Nemo. And there was just something that clicked, that I just saw beauty in the world in that moment. And something shifted that wasn't necessarily rational, or at least not rational in typical, syllogistic sense, but we're just pointed to some kind of transcendence in the world. So I really resonate with that as well.
Yeah, where the new atheists spend their entire career saying religion isn't rational. The religious response used to be, yes, it is. Now it seems to be something like, yeah, I know.
Well, I just want to speak up as well for the fact that these other ways of coming to believe things, by the same token, they're not irrational necessarily. They're just, as you said, they're not a 3-point argument philosophically.
Irrational.
I just think there are other ways of knowing things in the world, and people are more open to that. They're realizing that beauty is not something that you arrive at through a philosophical argument. It's something you just apprehend, but it's true. So I think the danger is when you sort of say people are coming to faith through these non-rational means. That somehow means you're kind of casting shade on it. No, it's just the way in which we come to all kinds of beliefs in life through that mode of thinking.
To help provide an analogy, perhaps, would this be a fair representation? Like, I don't truly come to know what love is by reading a proposition, God is love, or love is X, Y, or Z, but I might read a story like the story of the prodigal son, in returning to a father, and I experience something through listening to that story, and it's through that I come to understand what love actually is. So is this the kind of thing where we're talking about non-propositional kind of reason?
Yeah, I would say so. I think it's just, it's a shame if we kind of dismiss people's personal experience as somehow non-valid. Now, it may not be something that can convince someone else, and that's the advantage of the objective, rational approach, if you like, to faith. We can debate, the Kalam cosmological argument or whatever, because we're all kind of agreed basically on the objective data out there, if you like. But as I said, it's, in my experience, apologetics, which is this sort of rational intellectual defense of the faith, what it's primarily good at is actually removing roadblocks to faith, I think, giving people kind of intellectual permission to walk down the road. But you still have to want what's on offer. There's still a sense in which the desire for God is absolutely central. If that's not there, no intellectual argument, I think, will never persuade you, because you have to want what's on offer in the end. So for me, it's important to just recognize that the heart is still kind of the thing. It's the seat, if you like, of ultimately what we desire. So yeah.
Yeah, I think I once, you might be more familiar with the reference itself, but I think I once heard our sort of reasoning, we think it's like steering a horse, when it's more like trying to steer an elephant.
Sure, yeah.
Which is a very slow kind of process. But you were going to say...
Yeah. I was going to say that I think a lot of people go further and actually condemn the principally rational approach. I think that's what Lewis is doing in that prayer. I think he's saying that it's a bad thing to identify principally with the rational argumentation and think that that's the way it's supposed to be done.
I mean, I've read the prayer, the poem you're referencing a few times. I don't think he's denigrating reason.
Should we do it?
We should get the poem up, shouldn't we?
I think, I can give it a go.
Yeah.
Oh,
I used to be able to...
This is a treat.
Have you actually memorized it?
Let's find out.
Okay.
From all my lame defeats, and oh, much more, from all the victories I seemed to score, from cleverness shot forth on thy behalf, at which whilst angels weep, the audience laugh. From all my proofs of thy divinity, thou who'st give no sign, deliver me. Thoughts are but coins, let me not trust instead of thee their thin-worn image of thy head. From all my thoughts, even my thoughts of thee, O thou fair silence, fall and set me free. Lord of the narrow gate and needle's eye, take from me all my trumpery, lest I die.
Yeah, Matt.
Which I think is an indictment of reason as a means to believe in God, at which whilst angels weep, the audience laugh. From all my proofs of thy divinity, thou who'st give no sign, deliver me. I think it's quite a damning report on the use of reason in this sort of argument for God's existence and quarrel over religion.
Brilliant rendition of that poem. I'm amazed. You've obviously got a mind that is able to capture and digest these things. My only comment would be, I think that was a prayer that Lewis was saying for himself. Deliver me from believing that I can do your job for you, God, essentially, through my own intellect and ability. But Lewis was absolutely committed to reason as integral to Christianity. I mean, he wrote Mere Christianity. He wrote, his own conversion to believing in God was essentially an intellectual process. I think it's just that he recognizes that there is a huge danger in believing your own hype. That ultimately, of course, it's God's job and God's prerogative in the end, and that. So I've never read that poem as an indictment of reason. I think it's about humility in the face of God, who is so much higher than any of our intellectual thinking and thought.
Thank you so much. The next time I preach, Alex, can I invite you to give the altar call? Quite persuasive. We started a little bit late, so we're going to take about 20 minutes now. We're going to engage with some of the questions. You can continue to submit them. You can see up in Slido. I'll just do the top voted question first, posed to Alex. I am unfamiliar with this tweet, so you might have to give some context.
Oh, dear.
I will read it. They would like some first-hand response.
Is it one of my tweets?
Yes. It's a three-part question. So last year, Alex posted on Twitter, X, concerning an 1807 version of the Bible censored for slaves. Although I won't assume Alex's intention of posting this, the existence of such a Bible would imply that slaves might identify with or be inspired by these censored biblical stories. So would Alex be willing to acknowledge religion's potential for positive, even liberatory social change?
Absolutely, I would. That's a wonderful, wonderful observation, because that was a sort of... I try to sort of copy these popular Twitter accounts that manage to get a lot of engagement by doing these interesting historical threads, but it turns out I just sort of elicit a lot of negative response and misunderstanding. But that is a good response. The Slave Bible is a Bible that was a sort of edited Bible, which is best. It's sometimes described as like a censored Bible if it's taken out. I think it's more appropriate to consider it like selected texts, in the way that you might have, Bible verses for grief or Bible verses for whatever. Like, this is a sort of Bible verses for use specifically for sort of reading to slaves in the West Indies. And the interesting thing, it has a lot of things removed from it. And so the question of, and I talked about this in an episode where I was going over the slavery that's rampant throughout the Old Testament, and there's this interesting question to be raised. Well, hold on a second. If the Bible is so pro-slavery, then how could you have a Bible for slaves that requires taking things out? For a start, I don't think they were necessarily taken out. Like I say, I think it's more of an editorial. But the things that are taken out, I think are taken out because, at best, this text says one thing on one day and another on the next. Like, if you read the Hebrew Bible's legislation on slavery, there is just no way to come away from it thinking that God was not okay with the ownership of other human beings, with bequeathing them to children as inheritable private property, with mistreatment of them so long as they're not an Israelite slave, and therefore also doing it based on, I would say, maybe race, maybe tribe, whatever term you want to use. That's definitely there. There's just no contest. And then you find that there's something like, so the story of Exodus, for example, is taken out of the slave Bible. Because, and also to the point, will I recognize that religion can be used for good in this respect? Of course, because a lot of the abolitionists were Christians. Martin Luther King is the Reverend King, and constantly sort of flowing is this biblical rhetoric. The problem is that I think it's simply being taken out of context. I say, who is misreading the Bible here? The person who reads and thinks that slavery is in principle a moral abomination, or the person who reads and says, actually, I think slavery is okay. The ownership of other human beings is okay sometimes. I think the first person is misreading the text. The Exodus story that's taken out from the slave Bible is the story of the liberation of God's chosen people from slavery in Egypt. What happens next? He brings them to the Promised Land, where there are people already living, and they deal with that problem by massacring and enslaving them. So God is not anti-slavery, God is anti-Israelite slavery. But of course, if you take the Exodus story and say, go to Pharaoh and let my people go and all this kind of stuff, it sounds pretty good. And if you read that bit in isolation, it might engender a sort of, the spirit of liberation amongst slaves. But if they had the capacity to read the entire text, I think they would have come away with a different idea. Another text that would probably be removed is where Paul says that there is neither slave nor free, male nor female. This is constantly quoted to me as an indication that the New Testament is anti-slavery. Neither slave nor free, for we are all one in Jesus Christ. This is not a commentary on the institution of slavery on planet Earth. Think about what's said next. There is neither slave nor free, nor male or female, for we are all one in Christ. So if you want to make an argument that this somehow delegitimizes the earthly concept of slavery, you've also just made an argument to delegitimize the earthly concept of gender, which I don't see a lot of Christians trying to do. Clearly, they're not talking about the fact that men and women don't exist or shouldn't exist or aren't different. They're saying that in respect to our communion with Jesus, none of that matters. So similarly, where it says neither slave nor free, it's not, in fact, because of the male and female bit, I think it's actually reaffirming those categories of slave and free, and just saying that in relation to your salvation through Jesus, that's not relevant to you being saved. But you can see why these verses are taken out. Because if you read to people, there is neither slave nor free, for we are all one in Jesus Christ, they're probably going to develop a bit of an anti-slavery sentiment, or at least be able to latch onto that to use as part of their movement, which slave owners aren't going to want, even if they would be doing so by taking the verse out of context. So that's why I think that slave Bible exists and is edited, but I don't think it gives us reason. And by the way, even if it did, even if the verses that were taken out did actually explicitly say slavery is wrong, ownership of other human beings is wrong, if it said all that explicitly, we'd still have to contend with the fact that we now just have a book that contradicts itself and said a different thing if you go to an earlier passage.
I'd love to make a few responses. So I think there's a few things I would want to say. I agree, there's lots of difficult, troubling passages in the Old Testament to do with warfare, slavery, and so on. Having said that, the point is that all the people who fought for the abolition of slavery were essentially Christians. Well, no, not all of them, but the vast majority of the weight behind the abolitionist movement came from Quakers, evangelicals, Shaftesbury, and so on, at the expense of the British Empire, in terms of, it's a very costly thing to end the slave trade. Likewise, in the early church, what you're seeing there is absolutely, there are slaves and masters. Paul is writing his letters to households where there are slaves and masters. But the point of the whole thing is that itself was incredibly countercultural, because the church was a place where the slave and the master both came and were, as it says in Galatians, one in Christ. Mm-hmm. Now, did that abolish the social category of slave and master? No, of course it didn't, because that was just the de facto way that the world existed. Slavery, the fact that today we believe slavery is wrong is very peculiar when you look at the history of the world. It's very, very bizarre. And what's happening, I think, in the early church is that they're not expecting to overturn this huge social norm in one go. But what they do is radically undermine it by having the slave and the master on equal terms in that setting. So one of the verses that I'm sure was left in the slave Bible was, slaves, obey your master. Okay. Probably the next verse was taken out, which was, master, treat your slaves well, do not treat them harshly, and so on, because they are your brother in Christ. Okay. So that in itself is absolutely radical in the Greco-Roman world. No one else was saying that, okay? And when you have a book like Philemon, where Paul has taken in a runaway slave and sent him back to his master and says, I'm sending him back not as your slave, but as your brother in Christ, that is establishing a very, very different trajectory to everything else happening around it. So I just disagree with this idea that, you could read it this way, you could read it that way. The reason the abolition movement was absolutely led by Christians is because they read the Bible, in my view, the right way. And it's not a kind of, well, it says this and it says that. Obviously, there are parts of the Bible where slavery is part of is kind of being at one level recognized and kind of codified in the Old Testament. But to simply point to those verses and say, there you see, God approves of slavery, is to basically treat the Bible like a fundamentalist and say we just read off ethics and morality by reading verses sort of solo in the Bible. The Bible is a story of God's revelation over time, and it's basically what we get in the end. The fact that you find those verses morally repugnant is because I'm going to do the Tom Holland thing, is because you are the inheritant of a Christian tradition, which you absolutely read the Bible as a Christian.
We might need that other microphone.
So for me, it's about stepping back and saying, look, forget about like the intricacies of the Old Testament. How did we get to this point? And it's absolutely because something happened through the Bible, through Jesus, through the early church that led us to the view that you can't buy and sell people.
I do want to move on, but can we give you a 1-minute rebuttal if you would like?
I'll try my best. There are so many things to say. Yes, it still does depend where you look, I'm afraid. You'll know as well as I do that in 1 Peter, we read the words, slaves, be good to your masters, not only to the kind, but also to the cruel. right? And so if somewhere else it says slaves be good to your masters and masters be good to your slaves, again, what we're dealing with is a text that contradicts itself. So much to say. Secondly, like the whole sort of, well, this is actually a Christian movement. I wonder why it took some, like over 1,000 years for people to work this out at a time that just so happened to coincide with the Enlightenment. That's when people realized that this is what the Bible was getting at all along. I don't know about that. It doesn't seem that way to me.
Well, that's a historically naive way of looking at it, because slavery essentially was a thing of the past by medieval times, and the impetus was there from the very beginning of the early church. So things do develop slowly. There's no doubt about that. But
I'll tell you what you can do. You can say, so the first thing to really emphasize is that the kind of slavery described in the New Testament, I believe, is totally different, both from antebellum slavery of the American South, which is what people tend to think about when they think about slavery, but also the slavery of the Old Testament. I mean, the Old Testament, people always euphemize it in this way, I think. They say, yes, the Old Testament may contain some descriptions and stuff about slavery. No, it sort of explicitly legislates on exactly what you are and are not allowed to do. And like, I don't have time to go over the verses. I've sort of been talking about them ad nauseum. You'll be aware of them as much as I will. I can do it if you like, but I think most people know that this is the case. The kind of slavery that's probably being described by Paul, for example, or in Peter, or indeed by Jesus, who himself at one point implicitly condones the institution of slavery. But again, we're talking about a totally different kind of slavery. It is like, okay, sure, I can see why that would be the case. It's not a huge problem. What you can do is you can say that slavery starts to get really, really ugly with the transatlantic slave trade. So it's not just be sort of, indentured servitudes, who are still treated pretty badly. They have their ears pierced if they want to remain a slave for life, if they want to remain with your wife and kids, that kind of stuff. But it's nowhere near the experience of a slave in the American South. That gets really bad, and people begin to grow uncomfortable. I don't know if it would have to be a uniquely Christian thing that would start to grow uncomfortable by that. But if that's the case, what the Christian can do is they can say, this isn't the way to treat your slaves. What you can't do is say that anything in the Old or the New Testament explicitly or should give us the belief, or even imply the belief, that in principle the ownership of other human beings as private property is wrong. That's not to say that people can't own other human beings as private property in a way that's much more morally justifiable than something like the American slave trade. But people today don't just want to say, well, that kind of slavery was really wrong, but I recognize that its necessity as necessary to a social hierarchy. They want to say it's wrong in principle to own other human beings. If you want to do that, you do not have a biblical basis for it. And in fact, you have a biblical basis for believing the exact opposite.
I certainly don't want to shut down debate.
Justin might want to say, I think it's kind of always
like
feels unfair to have the last word.
We could go back and forth.
Whoever asks questions,
all I'll say is that if you're looking for an explicit denunciation of slavery, you won't find that in the Old or New Testament. What I'm arguing is that there is a change in the way people think about it. And if you go to a Frederick Douglass, who was a slave and who was beaten, why did he become a Christian and be part of the abolition movement? It's because he read the Bible. And somehow, even though you say, Alex, if you read the Bible, you're just as likely to approve of slavery as not, something in the Bible spoke to him and said, this is wrong. And he was able to call Jesus his Lord, even as his slave master had claimed Jesus was his Lord. So it's not just about reading verses in the Bible. It's about what that story does to people. And I agree. For some people, they'll use it as a justification for slavery. The fact that we both agree it's wrong, though, I will come back to this. Maybe we can debate it later. The fact we both agree it's wrong is because we're products of a Christian culture. Because if we were having this conversation in Rome or Greece, we would have just thought the same as everyone else. Of course, slavery is.
And ancient Israel.
Arguably, yes. But here we are, products of a Christian culture, both agreeing slavery is wrong.
Yeah.
This sounds like the seed of another great event. Perhaps we get.
There is so much to say, but I want to make sure we get to it. I mean, I would say, as I said to the national originally, whatever development has happened there, it came a bit too late. The Amalekites and for let's just carry on. I
appreciate it, Alex.
I've got loads of stuff online, so it's kind of unfair to take up the time doing.
Let me combine two questions. This discussion is narrowly focused on faith in Western society and culture. You might even say the UK in particular. What about highly documented surge of Pentecostalism in Africa and Latin America? I'll tie with this one, a lot of binaries in this talk, West versus East, right versus left, Christianity versus Islam. How could we discuss religion without being limited by these dichotomies? So if we can kind of take those both together, and I'll hand you a mic so you guys can have a bit more of an exchange.
I'll keep this one. I feel like this is going to add less arguments.
Yeah. No, I mean, in a sense, the scope of my book and my podcast really is talking about the West. So I absolutely acknowledge that actually Christianity, in some ways, is growing faster than it ever has done in history in places like Latin America, China, parts of the Middle East. So absolutely, there's a much bigger picture. I'm really just talking about the West. The binaries, and should we be talking, I guess, in more general terms about religion? I mean, I think it is a fact that religious belief generally is on the rise globally, and atheism as a proportion, interestingly, of the overall is diminishing, even as more and more people are non-religious in the West, because interesting, just purely on the fact they're not having as many kids and so on, it's declining as a proportion of the global population, atheism. So there's a lot more that could be said. I agree. Yeah, I guess the reason I kind of do force a binary on this in terms of I won't be, I'm not going to be celebrating a boom in Islam or Eastern religions or anything else. Is again, comes back to the fact I'm a Christian. I've got a horse in this race. I do believe that Jesus is the answer. What he said about being the way, the truth, and the life is literally true. So for me, that's why I guess I'm interested in the signs that suggest that actually there is a Christian revival. Absolutely accepting that other things are going to be coming in the wake of this meaning crisis as well. I just don't think they have the answer to the meaning crisis in the way Christianity does.
I don't have a whole lot to add. I mean, yeah, globally the picture changes statistically, and as Justin points out, that's got a lot to do with birth rates. But yeah, I know. As far as I'm aware, there's sort of an increase in Pentecostal Christianity across Africa. Sure, yeah, I think that's happening. I can't remember what the actual sort of question was, but it's probably more a question for Justin anyway. But yeah, no, that's definitely happening. But it depends on the scope of the book, like you say. If we're talking about a surprising rebirth of belief in God globally, it's not actually that surprising, because for the whole history of humanity, atheism has been a small minority of people. If we're talking about a surprising rebirth of belief in God somewhere like the UK, I just don't see it happening.
I guess to follow up on this, and I don't mean to put you on the hot seat, so you can defer if you'd like, but would you celebrate, you said you probably would celebrate a certain brand of Christianity growing. How would you feel about certain other beliefs in the divine, the spiritual?
I think it depends, by their fruits you shall know them. It depends how it makes people behave. It depends how it makes them sort of conduct international affairs. It depends how it makes them vote in elections. I mean, I don't know. You don't know until it happens. That's why you have to be quite careful. But any kind of religious tradition that grows in popularity and causes people to act with more consideration and kindness and charitability, I think is probably the most important of those virtues, I think would be a good thing, be it tied to Jesus or not. But I do think that the figure of Jesus is probably the best shot that we have at that when it comes to religious traditions, yeah.
I'm going to put that on a t-shirt. We've talked a bit about rationality, and you eloquently prayed, if I could say that. C.S. Lewis prayer.
Yeah, you're not wrong.
A question came in. What is the one piece of evidence that convinces Justin that there is a God? And what is one piece of evidence that convinces Alex that there is not?
No.
Proposition.
Another binary. Well, caveat, there isn't one piece of evidence that persuades me. It's a whole lot of evidences, both the intellectual ones that we've been talking about sometimes, but personal experience, all kinds of other factors that have gone into me coming to the point where I believe Jesus is Lord. So I really don't want to say the one piece of evidence that convinced me. There are some intellectual arguments that I found quite helpful. So I'm a big fan of something called the moral argument for God, which Alex has gone through a number of times on his channel with people, which is essentially the argument that actually brought C.S. Lewis to faith in God, not to Christianity per se, but certainly to belief in God, that essentially to believe in objective morality, right and wrong, there must be essentially something beyond nature, beyond just, biology, evolution, whatever, that there is essentially a moral lawgiver. So it's a kind of quite an intuitive argument, because we believe we're moral creatures. We believe in morality. It kind of forces itself upon us in a very kind of immediate way. And I think the only way to make sense of that really exists is if there is a God who has sort of invested the universe with that moral dimension. So that would be one argument, but one of a number that kind of altogether convinced me that it makes sense to be a Christian.
It's hard to say. I've traditionally chosen to refer to the problems of divine hiddenness and the problem of evil. I prefer to say the problem of suffering, because there's sort of a knee-jerk theistic reaction anytime I use moral terminology. And so I think that what has to be accounted for is the depth of suffering, not only amongst humans, but also amongst animals as well. Now, strictly speaking, this doesn't disprove a first cause. It doesn't disprove some kind of sustaining, being which is being itself that upholds the universe. But the traditional picture of benevolent supervisor of the universe does begin to break down when you encounter the truth of human and animal suffering. To be told that a deer that gets its leg caught under a branch that's fallen on it, that starves to death in confused agony, is either something which doesn't matter, or is something which can sort of be explained by some reference to higher order goods or free will, which sometimes seem quite convincing in the human case, but I don't think in the animal case whatsoever. And you ask yourself which is more likely. You ask yourself what you would expect to find if the universe were supervised in the manner described by Christianity. And I don't think you would expect to see anything like this. However, if you assume atheism, materialism, there's a question as to whether you get a universe at all, of course, which is a more fundamental question, an objection that can be raised to this point. Nothing's foolproof. But presuming the existence of a universe and animals within it, what would you expect to find if this was an amoral arena of accidentally existing organisms competing in a struggle for survival and nothing more? I think it much more accurately, or much more predictably, accords with what we observe. And a lot of people think that they sort of consider the problem of evil, and it's difficult to do. Like, it's difficult to remember what it's actually like to be in pain. I mean, I could describe painful experiences to you, but if you don't feel it or you don't see it in front of your very eyes, it's very difficult to remember the reality of it. And it's not a nice thing to do. I wouldn't recommend it, but you can seek out. You can hear stories. You can watch videos online. We live in that kind of world of the most gruesome and unimaginable suffering known to mankind. If you've got a sort of dodgy, hacky access to the dark web, right? It's there. You can see it, and it's very difficult in the face of that to just sort of say, it's got something to do with human free will, when actually the thing that's caused this suffering is a tsunami that's ripped a mother from a child. That's got something to do with higher order goods. You couldn't have bravery if you didn't have fear. You need the first thing to get the second thing, as if the second thing isn't only valuable insofar as it overcomes the first thing. Developmental trajectory, the moral development that it brings about in a human being to encounter these kinds of evils and overcome them, as if some people aren't just immediately exterminated by these evils, by these events. Of course, there's like a solution to that disposal problem, because they just get to go to heaven. I was told recently by William Lane Craig, discussing the slaughter of the Canaanites throughout the Old Testament, that where God commands the slaughter of children, this is okay because they go straight to heaven. And so God is actually instilling an incommensurable good upon them. And for the men and the women, they must have been guilty enough for God to see it fit that they all get destroyed without a single survivor. And it's uncontroversial that this is what God commanded people to do in the Old Testament. We're just told that there are different reasons why this might be the case. William Lane Craig, the same person who relies on that moral argument all the time, quite heavily, and says, well, you have moral intuitions, and if you've got moral intuitions, where else can you ground them but in theism and in belief in Christianity? And then in the same token tells me that I have to abandon one of the most fundamental moral intuitions that I hold, which is that the murder of children is sometimes permissible, in order to make a case about the Canaanites. So, I don't know, I get it, I get the moral feeling, but that moral feeling that I have within me that is appealed to prove the existence of God just as powerfully tells me that there might not be one, and specifically not the one described by at least the Old Testament.
Thank you so much. One last question, and then we'll get you guys out of here. We will have a drinks reception after, so hang on tight, and we'll get you there. Alex, what draws you to the study of Christianity? Participate in so many conversations like this one, although you don't believe in God. I presume you don't. Perhaps, Justin, we can go to you after about what draws you to continue these conversations.
It's hard to say. People have their interests. I'm thoroughly interested in religion as a sociological and anthropological phenomenon. I'm thoroughly interested in the Bible as a text, both literary and historically, the influence that it's had over our thinking. A lot of fiction, a lot of mythology is indebted to the Bible. A lot of our language is indebted to certain translations of the Bible. That's fascinating. The stories contained within this text, I think I'm more interested in the Bible than anything else. It used to be that I was interested in philosophy of religion. That was because I was caught up in the new atheism thing. I thought that, religion is bad, let's try and disprove it. Now I just realized that this text, the Bible, it's just fascinating in the same way that I'm sure people become obsessed with, the Metamorphosis or with the Iliad or something. People spend their entire lives dedicated to this. And it would be a weird question to ask somebody, why do you spend your time going to conferences, debating and talking about interpretations of the Iliad if you obviously don't believe in this pantheon of Greek gods? It's a strange thing to ask them. It seems that it requires no more justification than that, well, to be honest, I just find it interesting. Maybe that's got something to do with what I studied. Maybe that's got something to do with my upbringing. My dad used to read the Iliad to me all the time. Maybe that's the same answer to me. It's got something to do with my upbringing. I used to read the Bible, at least in school. I find it interesting, and that's, I think, all there is to it. I'm not accusing you of this, but there's this undertone that people often give to this kind of question. It's like, well, you talk about God quite a lot when he supposedly doesn't believe in him. It's like, yeah, like you're allowed. It's possible to be interested in something that you don't think exists, and I think that's probably where I'm at. In other words, there's no argument to be formulated out of such an observation. I'm sure that in another life, I could have been a scholar of Greek literary classics instead.
I can't speak on behalf of all Christians, but I'm thankful you're in the conversation.
Yeah, and so am I, Alex. And I would say, I think you're a bit hard on yourself, because I think actually, I suspect it matters to you as well, whether it's true or not that God exists.
It matters if it's true. It matters if it's true. It doesn't matter if it's false. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. C.S. Lewis said the same
thing.
Yeah,
exactly.
Why do I continue having these conversations? I guess it's, to quote Alex, because Jesus is the best shot we've got. And I think...
That's unfair.
I agree. Wait. Slightly misquoting Alex. No, I mean, coming back, just to come in on what you said there, we do live in this world full of beauty, but full of all this awfulness as well, and all this suffering. I agree. The evidence is there for all of us to see. I just think the Christian story says, yeah, it is. It's bad. We live in a broken world. That's the whole point of the story. The reason I think Jesus is the best shot we've got is because it's a story in which God entered that world and took on all the brokenness, all of that stuff in some way, mysteriously. He took on himself on the cross, and giving himself flipped the script. Something happened where he encouraged people to live a completely different, radical life, a life where you do love your enemies. So for me, beyond all the philosophical questions and the important questions about suffering and evil and everything else, in the end, I've never found a more compelling story that actually meets those questions at the kind of experiential level, because this is a story about a God who did something about it. So for me, that's why I'm invested in this. I just think if there is a rebirth of belief in God, and I could be wrong, absolutely I could be wrong, but I think it's the best hope we have, and that's why I'm going to continue pursuing it.
Can we give them a round of applause? Thank you.
I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Alex O'Connor in Edinburgh, and I'm hoping to do more with Alex in the coming year. There were so many great conversations after the event as well, with those in attendance. If you were there, thank you so much for coming. I also enjoyed a late night pint of Scottish ale with Alex, Patrick and other friends at a nearby pub after the evening ended. Thanks again to Trinity Forum Europe for hosting the event. Now, the book we were debating was, of course, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and if you haven't read it yet, you can get signed copies via my website, justinbrierley.com. We ship them all over the world, and you'll get complimentary signed copies of both the books I've written if you become a gold supporter of the show. It makes a huge difference to me being able to produce these resources and participate in these live events too. I can only do it with your help, so if you'd like to get on board, again, do visit justinbrierley.com or click the link with today's show. For now, thank you for listening. Do keep reviews of the podcast coming through, share it on your socials and with whoever you might think might be interested. It's so good to hear of the way the show is impacting many, many people. Coming up next time, we return to our documentary format, continuing the 6th act of our series, looking at mind, meaning and the materialists.
But you're asking me to say where I've landed over a lifetime. I certainly feel strongly that there is something very powerful, of ultimate importance, of great beauty and the source of life and creativity which is behind this cosmos, that is expressed in its richness, complexity and responsiveness, because I believe the cosmos is conscious.
The Believing Brain, how Ian McGilchrist rediscovered the soul. We're diving into the mysterious world of consciousness. But as ever, you don't need to wait. You'll get access to our next episode right now when you become a silver or gold supporter. And this week, you can also get hold of my full video conversation with Stephen Meyer on science, the Big Bang, fine-tuning and biology. We've added it as an early release piece of bonus content for supporters. Today's show was a production of Think Faith in partnership with Genexus and with support from the Jerusalem Trust, editing assistance from Peter Byram. You can find out more on how to support my efforts to bring thinking faith to the secular and Christian world. Again, that's justinbrierley.com. The links are all with today's show. See you next time. Thanks for listening today, and to Ellis, who left this review saying, one of the best podcasts I've ever listened to. Historical, insightful, reasoned, and full of heart. So necessary in a culture that has forgotten why it is like it is. Just bought the book too. If you can leave a review, it helps others to discover the show. And if you want to buy the book, like Ellis did, you can get a signed copy from my website. As it happens, gold supporters of this show get signed editions of both my books anyway, plus lots of bonus content and early access. And of course, your support makes a huge difference to me being able to produce this podcast. So for the book or to support, visit justinbrierley.com or follow the links with the show notes.